Salt and light, one of my favorites as well. It's easy to talk about being the light of the world, light in the darkness, light casting out shadows and fear, light bringing things that were formerly unseen, God made visible, and light that exposes things that are kept hidden and in darkness. But what does it mean to be salt of the earth? Now, I know some people are a little salty. Hey, you kids, quit skateboarding on my sidewalk. You know, it's kind of irritable, kind of bitter at the world, kind of angry. I don't think that's what Jesus is going for when he talks about being salt of the earth. Now, I've heard some preachers, believe it or not, talk about us being salt to be rubbed in the wounds to irritate. I don't think that's what Jesus meant either. What was salt in Jesus' day? I think first, to really understand what Jesus is talking about as salt of the earth, you've got to kind of go outside of our culture back to ancient times, because they're not apples and apples. In Jesus' day, there were whole trade routes built on salt trade. It's a very precious commodity, as like gold or silver. Why? Well, think about this. At a time when much of the world was still unmapped and you have exploration expeditions, how are you going to travel long distances without preserving in some way, without refrigeration, food? You need to salt everything up to take those sailing trips around the Horn of Africa or out to the New World to begin to discover new lands and trade routes. How are you going to sustain an army? Any of you have served in World War II or Vietnam or Korea, hardtack, it's loaded with salt. So that the army, tens of thousands as they're going, Roman legions marching through North Africa or through Asia Minor, how do they sustain them without salt? Or if your city's under siege, how are you going to have a food supply that doesn't rot over months at a time without salt? You see where I'm going? It's super precious in the ancient world, very difficult to mine. Long before the days of Morton's, salt was tough to come by, and it was expensive. So you hear the expression from the Latin, the root is sol. We get words like salary. You are worth your weight in salt. From those ancient times, the worth of salt, precious commodity. So when Jesus is saying, you are the salt of the earth, on one hand, it's this valued, precious, one-of-a-kind kind of thing. We'll get to that in a moment. It's also this preserving agent that is vital to survival, to keeping food fresh, and to sustaining people. So, as bringing the gospel is a sustaining, life-giving way. But then there's also another dynamic to it that I don't think we often think about, and as Westerners reading this text. So, under Jesus' day and age, during his culture with his peers, something is happening to the Jewish people. And that thing that is happening is called Hellenization. What is Hellenization? It's the Greek culture, the Roman culture, Western thought, Western ways, influencing Judaism in ways that it had not been challenged before. So you have Jews who grew up learning Hebrew and speaking Aramaic, now learning Greek. Now learning Greek philosophy, Roman law. And there's a pushback from the Jewish people saying, wait a minute, don't forget what it is to be Jewish. Don't forget who it is that we call and name as God amongst the Greek and Roman gods. Stay true to who God calls you to be as a unique and chosen people. So there's also that angle of preservation in being salt that I'm sure people who heard Jesus speaking took as part of his meaning at that time. Now, is that what he meant when he says, you are salt of the earth? Now, being salt is to bring things to life. We talked about it a little bit in that children's time. Without salt at all to bring food, it lifts out the other ingredients of food. It makes it tastier. But too much of it can be deadly, can be lethal, right? So there's this challenge to be salt to others, but also to have a balance of how that saltiness comes across. Let me give you an example. I was in my first couple of years of ministry, going to a call at Christ Hospital. And I got on the elevator. I have my little Bible. Some of you have seen me with it. So it's easy to carry on hospital calls. And I get into the elevator. There's one gentleman in the elevator. And as soon as the door closed, I'm standing at the front, kind of. I said hi. And do you ever have this happen where you can just feel somebody stare on the back of your head? And so I feel this guy's kind of eyes boring into the back of me. And he says, "Excuse me, I see you've got a Bible there. Do you ever read it?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, are you saved?" And I began looking at the elevator. What floor are we on? No. And then he said, "Because if you're not, I can say a prayer with you right now and make sure your soul's going to heaven." Now, I don't want to bash, and I mean this sincerely, I don't want to bash this man's passion or conviction to share the gospel. That's a great thing, to want, to desire to please God. However, what I mean by being too salty in how you evangelize is, what this man was essentially saying was, in a quick snap judgment, I want to make sure your soul is going to heaven. I care about your soul. I don't really care about you. But I want to make sure your soul, because that way I'm doing my job and my reward in heaven, right? It's almost self-serving. There's a danger therein that in making assumptions about, he didn't know anything about me, didn't know where I was from, didn't know the circumstances of my life, pain, joys, sorrows, or joys that I carry, nothing. What Jesus is getting at is a salt that cares, not assault, which was what I felt in that elevator, but a caring for, and this is right in tune with Matthew's gospel again and again, a caring for your neighbor, carrying good news and joy to your brother or sister, and caring about them as brother or sister first. What that man was sharing was only a message of the gospel that is very heavy-handed in judgment. I've got what you need, whether I know you or not. And while the gospel might be a vital piece of life and life-saving, yes, but without taking the time to get to even begin to know a person, to have that relationship, to share that joy, that is salty, not necessarily salted. So when Jesus says, be salt of the earth, be light to the world, it's not a full court press of evangelism, not so much fishers of men, but harpooners of whatever has a heartbeat. Let's just get them into the boat and get them up to heaven. No, it's a real concern for the body and for those outside of it. It's a real concern for our neighbors who are poor. It's a real concern for our enemies, a legitimate concern for our enemies. Let me say this. Matthew would say, I don't think I'm outside the bounds of interpretation, to say, Matthew would say, it is a beloved and great gift if you know your Bible inside and out, if you pray beautiful prayers, if you come to church every Sunday. But if you have all those beautiful things with God and you treat your neighbor or friend or stranger or enemy like trash, you have missed the gospel completely. Matthew says it another way to the Pharisees and teachers of the law, which he says shockingly, I have not come to abolish the law, not one iota, not one stroke, but to fulfill it in who I am. And unless your righteousness exceeds the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you'll never get into heaven. I think, oh my gosh, these guys know their Bibles inside and out. These guys are passionate about their desire to be right before God. What chance do any of us have? They're holier than holy people. But then he goes on to tell them, again and again in the gospel, you teachers in the laws of Pharisees, you are so concerned with your self-righteousness, so concerned with your personal piety that you have no compassion for your brother or sister in need. Your desire to serve the law of God is so strong that you strain out a gnat to get the law with precision, but you swallow a camel because you don't care to show mercy or grace to those around you. So you're great, Pharisees and scribes, about this relationship between you and God. Awesome. But what about the relationship between you and everybody else? That's where you're lacking. Whitewashed tombs. Really striving for holiness on the outside, but inside rotting away because you don't have a real heart, the kind of heart Jesus has for all the strangers. Let me put it to you a different way if I'm losing you a little bit. In Luke's gospel, you recall the story where Simon the Pharisee invites Jesus to his home. And as he and a bunch of church leaders, a bunch of teachers of the law and Pharisees who are very strict on the law and actually are questioning Jesus and his teaching methods and his style and who he is. And a woman comes in, an unnamed woman, and we're told that Simon and the other teachers of the law think this woman, if Jesus knew who she was, this sinful woman, where she's been, who she's been with, he wouldn't let her touch him like that. Wiping his feet, washing them with her tears and with her hair. And Jesus, looking at the woman, because they haven't looked at her at all, and ignoring the teachers of the law at the table, he says, Simon, to the Pharisee, do you see this woman? Maybe he had to ask him a second time. Simon, do you really see her? I know you see her sin. I know you see all the things that she's done wrong, all the ways that you've labeled her, but do you see her? You didn't give me oil for my head. You didn't wash my feet. You didn't receive me in any kind of grace when I came into your home as a guest. This woman has anointed my head with oil that costs a year's wages. This woman is wiping my feet, the dirt from my feet, with the tears, pleading for forgiveness. Do you see her? Salt and light. Jesus is telling his disciples, you have to not only see God, but your brother and sister. They are, as I said last week, this relationship, vertical with God, brother and sister, equal in Christ's sight. That which you do to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do to me. Now, being salt and light in the world is easy to say, it's easy to sing about, it's easy to pray about. It is really hard to do. Let me speak to that a little bit. Did anybody here have this challenge? I've been thinking about it so much the last couple of weeks as we're going through Matthew's Gospel. I've been thinking to myself, I struggle so much personally when I get too comfortable in life. When I get so much in a routine or I'm doing well. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing to do well, but my routine, the material stuff I surround myself with, sometimes becomes God. Not that I'm thinking it's God. But it becomes so comfortable, so easy, that I forget to listen to where God calls me out to places, to people, to take risks of faith, to stand up for things that would be uncomfortable, would be risk-taking, would cause me to be vulnerable to others. And it's also really tough, day in and day out, in a culture that says, you're all that matters. Just live to yourself. Yeah, build up bigger barns. Fatten that 401k. The stock market's doing great. Retire early. What does any of that stuff have to do with anything Jesus taught? Nothing. Gina Rossetti, church member, and another church member, a church visitor, and I were having a Bible study on Matthew's Gospel a couple weeks ago, and she said it beautifully. Gina, are you here back there? Are you back there? I told her I'd share this. She said, salt and light, it's as if Jesus is saying, because salt was such a tradable commodity. It was such a high-priced item that Jesus is really, in my mind's eye, talking about economics, transactions. And he's saying, you are worth so much more than you can possibly imagine as my disciples. But the economics I'm talking to you about, and this is really pointed to us today, is an economics where the transactions is between people and other people. Not commerce, not how much you own, not what titles you've gotten, not how wealthy you are or what side of the street or what community you live in, but it's how do you value each other? How do you trade in the commodity of the love of God and the grace of God? How do you live that out in a day-to-day relationship? Are you rich in things, or are you rich in relationships? There is a difference. Two different kinds of wealth. And the one that Jesus, think about this. This salt and light is sandwiched between the Beatitudes, which say, blessed is your life if you live in all these kinds of upside down values compared to the culture of the world. And then he goes into the law and saying, you've heard it was said, don't commit murder. I say, think bigger than that. Don't even speak an insult to your brother or sister. You fool. You idiot. That's wounding too. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say, don't even look at somebody lustfully because you've already objectified them and devalued them in the image of God in which they're made. The law is not just black and white. It's expanded to every aspect of your relationship with each other. I've come not to take it away, but to live it out in the flesh and show you what this law really looks like. Salt and light. How do you live into these relationships in ways that aren't rubbing salt into the wounds, but living out, bringing out the best and preserving what I've taught you? Philip Woolman said, who was a Christian leader for the president in the Clinton and Bush eras, said, the hardest part is not in being Christian for a day, but being faithful day by day, maintaining confidence in what for all the world appears to be a losing cause as we look around the world around us, but continue to maintain and being dedicated to who God has called you to be, even when that may risk much in your personal life. He says the deepest question of all is not, do we ultimately see ourselves as a community based upon the law, or is there a deeper sense in which we are a community of mutual caring for each other, leading with love, leading with love? Author Anne Lamott, who some of you may be more familiar with than Phil Wogelman, says it this way when talking about being salt to the earth. She says, it might be that your God is uptight, judgmental, a perfectionist, but a priest, a friend of mine, cautioned me away from this standard of God, who loves you and then guides you, and if you're bad, then roasts you. God is the high school principal in a gray buttoned-up suit who never remembers your name, but is always unhappily leafing through your files of the things you've done wrong. If this is your understanding of God that is all punitive, maybe you need to blend in the influence of someone who's ever so more slightly amused by you, someone less uptight, someone who delights in you and treasures you. Gracie Allen might be a good example, or Mr. Rogers might work. She writes in Bird by Bird. The last thing I'd like us to wrestle with, in a world that is often narcissistic, in a world that, I was just talking to my friend from seminary this week who said, I've reached out to over 10 people this week by phone, and now a week has gone by and only one of them has called me back. Are we just that busy that we don't even have time for each other? Am I just that much of a troll or a jerk that people don't want to talk to me? Or are we so connected virtually that we're not really connected at all communally anymore? It's tough to be salt when everything that hinges upon being salt and light hinges upon being with each other, with our time, with our care. Jesus says it again and again in Matthew's Gospel. The kingdom of God isn't just above, it's here. It's whenever you gather with one or more people because that's where community and connection and relationship happen. You are salt and light, meant for so much more. Will you be a kingdom builder? Amen.